Dynamic range? I say it's overrated. Let's talk about it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. Today's question comes from Alisa B, and she wants to know, whenever a new camera comes out, there's always a lot of talk about its dynamic range. How important is dynamic range really? Thanks, Alisa, for sending that in. It's a great topic, and yes, some photographers love to geek out about it. There are also others who've heard the phrase 1,000 times and are still not totally sure what it means. So first, I'm going to talk about what dynamic range is, and then I'm going to tell you why maybe you shouldn't care that much. Now look, dynamic range is a really common principle in audio. The dictionary definition is the ratio of the largest to the smallest intensity of sound that can be reliably transmitted or reproduced by a particular sound system. So imagine a high-end sound system in a recording studio. It can play super deep bass and tiny little subtle details all at the same time and still sound clean with no distortion. Then you go ahead and play that same thing on your phone speaker and everything just gets kind of crushed together. The loud parts really dominate and the quiet parts get lost. The whole thing just feels flat. You could reliably say that the phone speaker has a smaller dynamic range than the studio system. In photography, we're using the same idea, but the signal isn't sound, it's light. And when photographers talk about dynamic range, we're talking about the range between the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows that a camera can capture in a single photo while still holding some detail. At the bright end, highlights can blow out. Once they clip, they're just white. It's pure white. The texture is completely gone. And at the dark end, shadows can get so deep that detail disappears and it just goes to pure black, or it just shows noise when you try to brighten it up. A dynamic range is basically the amount of breathing room you have between those 2 points of failure. And we usually talk about it in stops, and depending on how you measure it, some modern cameras can capture 11 stops or more of dynamic range. Now, in real life, our eyes seem to have an insane amount of dynamic range because our brain is constantly adapting and adjusting. We can look at a bright sky and a dark building at the same time and can see detail everywhere. Cameras, unfortunately, they can't quite match that. Modern cameras are way better than they used to be, but they have less dynamic range than we do in our eyes. And that's why this becomes a challenge, because every time you make a photo, you're choosing an exposure. You're setting your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, or the camera's doing it for you if you're in an auto mode, but either way, you're deciding how bright or how dark you want the overall image to be. Now, the scene doesn't have much contrast, no problem. You can usually pick an exposure that keeps detail in the highlights and still keeps the shadows within range. A histogram that sits nicely inside the edges shows exactly that. Everything just fits. But sometimes you have a scene with extreme contrast, meaning the brightest parts are way brighter than the darkest parts. A classic example is a bright sky with dark buildings. There's more dynamic range than the camera can capture in one exposure. So what you need to do is you need to make a decision on which to expose for and which to let go out of range. My feeling is that if what's happening on the ground is what you want people to focus on, then you should probably expose for that and just let the sky blow out. But if it's the cool sky that you want to show, then go ahead and darken your exposure and let the buildings go dark. You're going to lose at one end or the other either way. So, Alisa, when photographers say they want more dynamic range, it's because they want the camera to capture both ends at once so they don't have to make that decision. Hey, quick sidebar, by the way, if you've got a photography question you want me to answer, you probably know what to do by now. Just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit it right there on the site. If you want to keep up with everything I'm doing, thedavidbergman.com has links to all my socials, my free email list, a ton of educational videos, and a few discount and affiliate links. And if you're enjoying this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to Adorama's YouTube channel, and go ahead and tap that bell icon for notifications. It really helps us to keep making free photography content for you every single week. Okay, back to dynamic range. Now, something else to consider is the file format you're using. If you're shooting JPEGs only, you're basically committing to a smaller amount of tonal information right away because JPEG is a processed and compressed file. It's also 8 bits, so things like contrast, tone, and color are permanently baked into that image. So once highlight detail is gone, it's just gone. And if shadow detail wasn't ever saved, you can't just pull it out later from nothing without the file falling apart. So you really need to make the exposure decision very carefully if you're only shooting JPEGs of a high contrast scene. Of course, you could go ahead and bracket, which means you shoot multiple frames at different exposures and then combine them in post. That's essentially HDR, high dynamic range, because you're creating a final image that has a higher dynamic range than a single exposure would normally hold. HDR can work really well, but it does have some downsides. It takes a bit more time to work on. The images can look unnatural if you push them too far. It can be annoying to align if you shoot it handheld, and it doesn't really work with any fast-moving subjects because things are going to change between frames. For most photographers, the simplest way to get more flexibility in a single frame is just to shoot RAW. There's so many good reasons to use RAW files, but one of them is that they contain a lot more tonal information than JPEGs do. While it looks like you've lost the area at the edges of your histogram, there's actually more data saved in the RAW, which means you can recover some highlight and shadow detail in post-processing. Keep in mind that a histogram and the image in your viewfinder also, those are usually based on the JPEG data only. The extra tones in the RAW file are going to need to be brought back in post. In many situations, a single, well-exposed RAW file is going to give you enough latitude that you don't even need to bracket at all. Now, whenever a new camera comes out, one of the things people like to talk about is dynamic range. How many stops can I capture? How clean are the shadows? How much highlight detail can you recover? And if you really want to go down a deep rabbit hole, you can get pretty geeky with this stuff. For example, dynamic range changes depending on your ISO. Cameras usually have the best range at their base ISO, and it gets smaller as you go up. Sensor design and processing choices can affect dynamic range as well. There are also a bunch of different ways to measure dynamic range, so there's that also. But I'm just about helping you create great images. So I say dynamic range is overrated. I'm not saying it can't help in some situations. If you're photographing a white wedding dress next to darker suits, or you have an interior shot with bright windows, that extra dynamic range will be a huge help to balance out those two exposures. But of all the issues I see in photography, almost none of them involve not recovering enough shadow detail. The real issues are boring light, flat light, light coming in from all the wrong directions, or just a subject that's not separated from the background with light. Contrast is not necessarily a problem to be avoided at all costs. Bringing up all the shadows leaves nothing to the imagination. It just flattens the image and removes depth. Pure black can sometimes just be pure black. Your plan shouldn't be to just capture everything and then decide later. I think sometimes we take it for granted how good we have it today. National Geographic photographers in the old days were using films like Kodachrome 64. I bet you that film had less dynamic range than any of today's modern digital cameras. But those legendary photographers were still able to create some of the most iconic images ever made. They understood light, timing, and composition. Sometimes constraints actually force you to get creative. So maybe, just maybe, instead of shooting in bad light and planning to fix it in post, do what you need to do to get better light. Just move if you have to, or come back at a better time of day. Read the light, choose your angle, time the moment, and decide what matters. Because dynamic range can't create good light. It can only capture bad light with more detail. Alisa, I hope that answers your question. What do you all think? Do you care about dynamic range, or do you just shoot RAW and then deal with it later when you need to? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching me here on Adorama TV. I'll see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.